What if the biggest news of this war wasn't a battle at all, but a quiet decision made an ocean away that nobody in the mainstream press bothered to connect? On the same weekend, 3 of America's closest partners in the world all made the same choice, and none of them told Washington first. This video is going to show you why that matters far more than any missile strike. If you want the full picture instead of the version that fits into a 30-second clip, hit like right now, subscribe before you forget, and send this to the one person in your life who actually asks. Good questions about the news. Let's get into it. To really understand why this past weekend mattered so much, you have to rewind all the way back to the 28th of February this year, the day the United States and Israel launched a joint strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with several of his top commanders, right there in Tehran, in one of the most dramatic openings to any conflict in recent memory. Washington's theory going in was simple enough. Remove the head of the snake, and the body underneath it stops moving. Iran's government collapses, or at the very least, bends under the shock. The war ends quickly, and the world quietly moves on to the next headline. That is not what happened. Khamenei's son took over as the new supreme leader within days. The Revolutionary Guard tightened its grip instead of loosening it, and Iran responded to the strike by doing the one thing it had been preparing to do for decades. It shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil supply. Oil prices spiked. Global shipping companies pulled their vessels out. The world was suddenly living through one of the worst energy shocks in 50 years. 5 months later, the war was still going. And that is the part almost nobody outside the region was paying close attention to, because the headlines had moved on to other things. Munitions were running low. Gulf allies were absorbing missile and drone attacks with less and less American backup. And underneath all of that, something was quietly shifting. A change in how America's own allies saw their relationship with Washington. Then came the weekend of August 6th and 7th, and 3 separate stories broke, almost on top of each other. On their own, each one looked like a regional headline. Together, they told a much bigger story. The first story came out of Mecca, Saudi Arabia. On August 7th, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan signed what is now called the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement, a trilateral pact declaring that an armed attack on any one of the 3 countries would be treated as an attack on all 3. Analysts and media outlets almost immediately started calling it an Islamic NATO. And once you look at what each country actually brings to that table, you understand why the comparison stuck. Saudi Arabia brings enormous financial resources from decades of oil wealth. Turkey brings one of the largest, most battle-tested militaries in the region, along with a defense industry capable of building its own drones, tanks, and warships without needing outside help. And Pakistan brings something no other Muslim-majority nation has, a functioning nuclear arsenal. Put those 3 pieces together, and you're not just looking at a defense pact. You're looking at the outline of a completely new power bloc, one that does not depend on Washington's permission to exist. Why now, though? Why would 3 countries with very different histories and very different relationships with each other suddenly commit to defending one another this specific week? The honest answer is fear, and not fear of Iran directly. It is fear that the country they had leaned on for protection for decades might not be able to deliver anymore. For months, American bases across the Gulf had been absorbing drone and missile attacks. Air defense systems were stretched thin. Reports throughout the summer described American forces struggling to keep pace with the volume of incoming threats, even while trying to protect their own troops, let alone extend that protection to allies nearby. If you were sitting in Riyadh or Islamabad or Ankara watching that unfold, you would start asking yourself an uncomfortable question. If the world's most powerful military is struggling to protect its own bases, how confident can I really be that it will protect me when it matters most? That question is what actually built the Mecca Pact. Not aggression, not ambition, a very calculated hedge against uncertainty. There is a simple way to picture this. Imagine you live on a street where one really strong neighbor has always told everyone, "Don't worry, I've got this block covered." For years, that made everyone else feel safe enough not to bother installing their own locks or cameras. Then one day, trouble actually shows up, and you watch that same neighbor get knocked around trying to handle it alone. You do not stop respecting him, but you do go out and buy your own lock the very next morning. That is essentially what just happened in the Gulf. There is one more layer to the Mecca Pact worth sitting with for a second, and it is the one that makes diplomats genuinely nervous. The official text of the agreement does not mention nuclear weapons anywhere. But when reporters pressed Saudi officials directly on whether the pact extended to Pakistan's nuclear umbrella, nobody actually denied it. They simply called the agreement comprehensive, covering, in their words, all military capabilities. In diplomacy, that kind of careful non-denial is its own kind of answer. Saudi Arabia does not need to build a bomb of its own if it can sit close enough to a country that already has one and let the rest of the world draw its own conclusions. It is a strategy analysts sometimes Call borrowed deterrence, and it is a lot cheaper than starting a nuclear program from scratch. Right? Tap subscribe if this kind of connect the dots breakdown is what keeps you coming back. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me which of these 3 stories surprised you the most. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. Now, let's cross the ocean to the second story, because this one is about an ally quietly saying no. On that same weekend, the European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, reaffirmed a position Europe had actually been holding since March, that expanding its naval presence into the Strait of Hormuz was not something member states had any real appetite for. The line that stuck with people was blunt and simple. This is not Europe's war. That is not a small thing to say out loud. It is the kind of sentence that would have been almost unthinkable during the Cold War, when European capitals moved in lockstep with whatever Washington asked of them. So why the hesitation now? Part of it is exhaustion. Europe has spent years funding Ukraine's war against Russia, and many governments simply do not have the political appetite or the spare naval capacity to take on a second open-ended commitment in the Gulf. But part of it runs deeper than exhaustion. It is about trust and about resentment that had been quietly building for months. European officials have said plainly and repeatedly that they were not consulted before the strikes on Iran even began, despite the fact that the fallout, oil shocks, shipping disruptions, and security risks landed on European economies just as hard as anywhere else. When you start a fire and then ask your neighbor to help you carry water, you should not be surprised if that neighbor asks why they were not warned about the fire in the first place. And there is an economic layer sitting underneath all of this that makes Europe's frustration even sharper. Congress passed sweeping new sanctions. Legislation aimed at anyone still purchasing Russian energy, threatening steep tariffs on countries that keep buying Russian oil and gas. On paper, that sounds like a reasonable continuation of pressure on Moscow over its war in Ukraine. But here is the trap hiding inside it. Because the war in Iran shut off a meaningful slice of the world's oil supply through Hormuz, several European countries found themselves with fewer affordable options and leaned harder on Russian energy just to keep homes heated and factories running. So the same conflict that squeezed Europe's energy supply also put it at greater risk of being penalized for how it responded to that squeeze. From where several EU capitals are sitting, that does not look like solidarity. It looks like being punished twice for the same fire. Layer on top of that, a separate and much quieter dispute simmering over migration routes near Spain's North African enclaves, where tensions between Madrid and Rabat spiked sharply this year after Spain was one of the only European governments to refuse American military overflight requests during the war. Whether or not every part of that story connects as neatly as some analysts online suggest, the underlying pattern is real. Trust between Washington and its European partners has been fraying thread by thread since long before this specific weekend, and August 6th was simply the moment several of those threads became visible all at once. The bigger picture here is not that Europe has become an enemy of the United States. It has not. It is that Europe has started quietly building its own independent tools, its own missile defense projects that do not depend on American hardware, its own funding streams for Ukraine drawn from frozen Russian assets rather than fresh American aid packages, its own willingness to say no when a request does not clearly serve European interests. None of that happens overnight. It happens slowly, the same way trust erodes slowly, one unanswered phone call at a time. Now for the third story, and this is the one that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention because it involves the one country that has been quietly profiting from all of this the entire time, Russia. While the world was consumed by the Iran war, Russia's oil and gas revenue reportedly surged, driven directly by the higher global energy prices that the Hormuz closure created. Reports circulating around this same weekend put Russia's daily energy income at several $100 million, a dramatic jump from where it stood before the Iran war began. Think about the strange loop hiding inside that number for a second. A conflict that the United States entered partly to. Project Strength in the Middle East ended up quietly filling the war chest of the very government funding. A separate war against Ukraine, a war the United States has spent years and enormous sums trying to help Ukraine survive. It is very hard to design a more self-defeating outcome than accidentally financing your own rival, while you're busy fighting somewhere else entirely. And Moscow knows exactly how much leverage that windfall buys. Around this same weekend, Russian officials signaled they were open to negotiations, but only direct talks with Washington, deliberately sidelining Ukraine from the conversation entirely. That is not a small diplomatic detail. It is an attempt to turn Ukraine into a bargaining chip between two larger powers rather than a country with its own voice and its own future. At the same time, reports of Russian drones drifting into neighboring NATO airspace kept surfacing, A reminder that pressure along Europe's eastern edge never actually paused just because attention shifted to the Middle East. And here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because when a global power starts feeling stretched thin on conventional resources, tanks, missiles, munitions, ships, it tends to start leaning harder on the one category of weapon it hopes it never actually has to use. Around this same period, reporting emerged describing renewed Pentagon interest in smaller, more usable tactical nuclear options as part of broader strategic planning against near-peer rivals. Now, to be clear, planning documents and strategic reviews are not the same thing as an actual policy shift, and this deserves real caution rather than alarmism. But the fact that this conversation is happening at all, at the same moment that the treaty, which used to cap the number of strategic warheads both America and Russia could hold, has expired with nothing agreed to replace it, is exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous story that rarely trends online but genuinely shapes the next decade, far more than any single battlefield headline does. So here's the honest, complete picture, because a story like this deserves nuance, not just outrage. None of this means American power has vanished. It has not. The United States still operates the largest and most capable military on the planet. It still spends more on defense than the next several countries combined. The dollar is still the backbone of the global financial system, and no single event, not one weekend, not one pact, not one Russian oil windfall, changes that on its own. Anyone telling you America collapsed over a single weekend is selling you a headline, not the truth. But strength and trust are not the same thing, and this weekend was fundamentally a story about trust, not strength. 3 different groups of longtime American partners, Gulf states, European allies, and the fragile architecture of global arms control, all sent a version of the same signal within about 48 hours of each other. Gulf states hedge their security by building new partnerships that do not depend entirely on Washington. Europe drew a clearer line around what it will and will not commit troops and ships to. And the world's nuclear order kept drifting further away from any shared rulebook, with nobody currently at the table, trying hard enough to write a new one. None of those 3 things individually breaks the existing global order. But historians who study the decline of powerful nations will tell you something important, that empires rarely fall because a rival army defeats them in a single dramatic battle. They fall gradually when the countries relying on them start quietly building backup plans, when allies stop picking up the phone as quickly as they used to, when smaller powers start betting that the old guarantees might not hold the next time. They are truly tested. That is a much slower, much quieter kind of erosion, and it is exactly the kind that rarely makes for a dramatic headline, which is precisely why it tends to go unnoticed until it has already happened. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the full picture rather than just the loudest headline of the day. So do me one favor before the next video, and only if you actually mean it. Share this with someone who still thinks this war is a simple story about missiles and battle lines, because the real story is happening in boardrooms, forums, ministries, and signing ceremonies far away from any front line. So where does this actually go from here? A few things are worth watching closely over the coming months, not as predictions carved in stone, but as genuine signals. Watch whether the Mecca pact stays a piece of paper or actually turns into joint military exercises and shared command structures, because that difference tells you whether this is symbolic posturing or a real new alliance taking shape. Watch whether other countries in the region, Egypt among them, move to formally join what is already being called an Islamic NATO, because that would be the clearest sign yet that trust in the old American security umbrella is eroding faster than most people in Washington are willing to admit publicly. Watch European defense spending and European weapons programs, because every euro spent on a European-made missile system instead of an American one is a small, quiet vote for independence from Washington. And watch the conversation around nuclear arms control, because a world without any functioning treaty, capping the largest arsenals on Earth, is a genuinely more dangerous world than the one we were living in a decade ago, whether or not that fact ever trends on social media. None of these are certainties. They are threads worth pulling on, patterns worth watching, because the biggest shifts in how the world works rarely announce themselves with a single dramatic headline. They show up first as 3 quiet stories breaking on the same weekend that almost nobody bothered to connect. Let's slow down for a moment and really sit with why a single defense pact between 3 countries carries this much weight, because on paper it is just ink on paper. A signing ceremony, some handshakes, some photographs. What actually gives it weight is what each country is choosing to risk by signing it. Turkey is a NATO member. Officially, it already sits under one collective security umbrella. Choosing to build a second one, alongside Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, is not something a confident, fully reassured NATO ally typically feels the need to do. It is the kind of move a country makes when it is quietly asking itself what happens if the first umbrella stops being reliable. Pakistan, for its part, is stepping further into a role as a security guarantor for wealthy Gulf states, a role that comes with real financial benefits, but also real exposure if a crisis in the region ever actually calls that nuclear guarantee to be tested for real. And Saudi Arabia is essentially telling the world, quietly but unmistakably, that it no longer wants to be a country that only has one phone number to call in an emergency. That is the real story hiding underneath the Islamic NATO headline. It is not really about Iran at all, not directly. It is about three countries independently arriving at the same conclusion, that relying on a single security guarantor, no matter how powerful that guarantor has historically been, is a riskier bet today than it was a decade ago. Now think about how this ripples outward beyond just these three countries, because alliances rarely stay contained to their original members for long. Regional analysts have already floated Egypt as a likely next candidate, given its size, its military, and its own complicated relationship with Washington over the years. Indonesia and Malaysia, the two largest Muslim-majority nations in Southeast Asia, have been mentioned in the same conversations, even if nothing concrete has been signed yet. If even one or two of those countries formally joins in the coming year, what started as a three-way defense pact starts looking a lot more like an actual bloc, with its own combined economic weight, its own combined military manpower, and its own combined diplomatic voice at the United Nations and beyond. And here is a detail worth paying close attention to going forward. Pakistan has reportedly been positioned to help mediate conversations between Iran and the United States going forward, given its unusual standing as a nuclear-armed nation with working relationships on both sides of this conflict. Stop and consider what that actually means. A country that just signed a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia is now being looked to as a bridge between Washington and Tehran. That is not a minor diplomatic footnote. That is a genuine shift in who gets to sit at the table when the most consequential decisions in the region are being made, and it is happening largely outside the spotlight that usually follows major geopolitical shifts. Now let's turn back to Europe for a moment, because there is a piece of this story that deserves more attention than it usually gets: the human and economic cost sitting underneath the diplomatic headlines. When oil prices spiked the way they did during the worst months of the Hormuz closure, that pain does not stay contained to trading floors and government budget meetings. It shows up as higher heating bills for families across the continent. It shows up as fuel rationing in smaller economies that do not have the reserves to absorb a shock that size. It shows up in factories slowing production because energy costs eat too deeply into already thin margins. When European leaders talk about being cautious with military commitments abroad, they are also, whether they say it out loud or not, weighing the political reality that their own citizens are already absorbing real financial pain from a war they had no say in starting. That is part of why the phrase, "not our war," landed the way it did. It was not just a statement about military strategy. It was a statement about where the limits of public patience actually sit, back home, in ordinary households dealing with ordinary bills, long before any government official ever has to explain a naval deployment to Parliament. Now let's talk about what Russia's windfall actually buys, because a number like several $100 million a day sounds abstract until you translate it into what it funds. Energy revenue is not just profit sitting in a bank account. For a government fighting a prolonged war, it is the fuel, quite literally in some cases, that keeps tanks moving, that keeps drone factories running, that keeps soldiers paid and equipped for another month of fighting. Every dollar that flows into that system because oil prices spiked somewhere else in the world is a dollar that makes the war in Ukraine a little easier for Moscow to sustain and a little harder for Kyiv to outlast. That is the uncomfortable thread connecting a strait thousands of miles from Ukraine to trenches and front lines that have nothing directly to do with Iran at all. Global energy markets do not respect the neat borders we draw around separate conflicts. A shock in one region quietly reshapes the balance of power in another, almost every single time. And that brings us to the piece of this story that deserves the most careful, sober attention of all: the fraying state of global nuclear arms control. For decades, even during the tensest years of the Cold War, the world's major nuclear powers maintained some form of agreed framework limiting how many warheads and delivery systems each side could hold. That framework gave the entire planet a baseline of predictability, an agreed floor beneath the worst-case scenario. As of this year, for the first time in over 50 years, no such treaty exists between the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Nothing has formally replaced it yet. Layer on top of that renewed conversations in Washington about smaller, more usable tactical nuclear weapons, and you have the ingredients for a genuinely more unpredictable and more dangerous global environment. Not because any single country wants a nuclear conflict. Almost nobody actually wants that. But because the guardrails that used to make miscalculation less likely are quietly disappearing, one expired treaty at a time. There is also a Steelman worth giving here. because a fair analysis has to consider the strongest version of the counter-argument, not just the version that confirms the story you already want to tell. Someone could reasonably point out that America still operates more than 10 carrier strike groups, still outspends its nearest rivals on defense by a wide margin, and still holds the position of issuing the world's dominant reserve currency. They could point out that the Mecca pact, for now, is a signed statement of intent without a shared command structure or joint military exercises behind it yet. They could point out that European governments have walked back, tough talk before, only to fall back in line with Washington once the immediate crisis passed. All of that is fair, and honestly, a lot of it is true. Raw capability has not disappeared overnight, and skepticism about how far any of these shifts actually go is a reasonable, healthy instinct to have. But raw capability was never really the question here. The Soviet Union held tens of thousands of nuclear warheads right up until the year it collapsed. And the warheads did not save it, because the countries and republics that once depended on Moscow had already stopped believing the center could hold. Rome commanded the most feared legions in the ancient world for centuries, and those legions did not save the empire either, because its frontier provinces had gradually stopped believing Rome would show up for them when it actually mattered. Raw strength and genuine trust are two different currencies entirely, and history keeps demonstrating over and over again across very different eras and very different empires that a country can keep spending the first one freely while quietly running out of the second one without even fully realizing it is happening. That is really the lens worth applying to everything that happened this particular weekend. Not who has the bigger military, because that answer has not changed and probably will not change anytime soon, but who still fully believes the guarantees they were promised, and who has quietly started building a plan B, just in case those guarantees turn out to be worth less than advertised when the moment of real testing finally arrives. Before we get to what this all adds up to, quick favor. If your brain just connected a few dots it hadn't connected before, that is exactly what this channel is built for. So hit that subscribe button and let the notification bell do the reminding for you, because the next update in this story might land before you expect it. So let's pull all three threads together, because separately, they are interesting regional stories. Together, they describe something much bigger, a genuine test of whether the security architecture the world has relied on for the better part of 80 years still functions the way everyone assumed it would. Gulf allies responded to uncertainty by building a backup plan that does not run through Washington. European allies responded by drawing a firmer line around what they will and will not automatically agree to. And the world's remaining nuclear rivals responded by drifting further away from the agreed rules that used to keep the most catastrophic outcomes off the table. None of this means collapse is coming tomorrow. It almost never works that way. Predicting collapse on a specific date is usually a good way to be wrong. What it does mean is that the assumptions underneath decades of American-led global order are being quietly tested in real time by people making very practical, very unemotional calculations about risk. Not because anyone hates the United States, not because anyone wants a chaotic world, simply because when your own security might be on the line, betting everything on one guarantor, no matter how powerful that guarantor has been in the past, starts to look like a riskier gamble the moment that guarantor shows any sign of being stretched thin. Here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Alliances are not built during peaceful, comfortable years. Nobody signs a mutual defense pact when everything already feels safe. Alliances get built during exactly the kind of uncertain, stretched thin moments the world just lived through this past weekend. So when three separate longtime partners of the United States all quietly hedge their bets in the very same 48-hour window, the real question is not whether America is still powerful. Clearly, it still is. The real question is whether power without full trust is enough to hold a global order together the way it used to. History has answered that question before, more than once, and it rarely answered it in favor of the power that assumed its allies would simply wait around and keep believing forever. That is the story underneath the story this weekend. Not a battle won or lost, but a quiet, careful recalculation happening in capitals from Riyadh to Brussels to Islamabad, the kind of recalculation that rarely makes the front page on the day it happens, but almost always ends up defining the decade that follows. Think back to where we started this video. A strong neighbor everyone had always trusted to handle the whole block. That neighbor has not disappeared. He is still standing on the same porch, still armed, still capable, still the most powerful presence on the street by a wide margin. But for the first time in a very long while, several of his neighbors went out and quietly bought their own locks anyway, just in case. And once people start locking their own doors, even a little, even carefully, even while still being polite and friendly at the fence, Something fundamental about that street has already changed, whether anyone ever says so directly out loud or not. Watch this space closely over the months ahead. The headlines you're not seeing right now, the quiet signing ceremonies, the treaties that quietly expire without replacement, the naval missions that quietly do not get expanded, are usually the ones that end up mattering the most when people look back and try to explain exactly when the old order started giving way to something new.